It's a first line day. We have a new gate, gate 7. This is the gate of the army, the role of the self in interaction, and we know that it's one of the role gates. And here in line 1, we find the authoritarian. The dictionary definition of an authoritarian is someone who expects strict obedience to one's authority. This is your old-fashioned Victorian father figure. It is based on a principle that the leaders, or the head of the family in that sense, or the leaders are not the people, have the final say. The father, not the children. It relates to favouring a concentration of power in a leader or an elite figure. Someone not constitutionally responsible to the people. You don't elect your father, after all. And it favours blind submission to its authority. This is the 7th gate, the first line. So through genetic continuity, and because this is a role gate, we find that all first lines are fundamentally authoritarian. There is a lifetime learning here. It says the iron hand, both enlightened and despotic. Either way, it's still an iron hand, right? The exaltation says, as in the basic values and rules imposed on a child, the capacity of the self to guide with authority. Our political leaders, who are authoritarians, they generally regard the people as children. They don't regard the children as people, that's for sure. The people are regarded as children, as being childish, and are treated accordingly. For most of our history, that is the way that it's worked. Those who ruled us assumed that we were rather infantile. We couldn't take responsibility for ourselves. So they didn't bother to educate us, for example. They treated us like children. They gave us enough to be able to survive, and that was about it, really. So we had kings, we had presidents, we had shahs, we had popes. These people who ruled over us and considered us to be rather immature, rather childish, and needing to be looked after. We were the children of the state. We belonged to them in that sense. And, to be fair, we did give them our authority to treat us that way, whether we did it consciously or not. That was the way that things have unfolded. In the detriment, we find the distorted intellect believes that only it knows best. The capacity of the self to insist that its authority is best. So this is the other side of the authoritarian. And it might seem like a negative detriment, but it's how it's supposed to be. It doesn't need fixing and making into the exaltation. And that is true for all of these lines. None of them are wrong. None of them are broken. None of them need changing in any way. And it is, maybe I see it as all good, it's all bad, it's all great, it's all terrible. But we don't have to think of them in those terms. We don't have to associate or invest any word prejudice in any of these. We look at them, we take them for how they are. We see that they are a signpost for behavior in a not-self world. I've mentioned this before, that the I Ching, the Rave I Ching, it's a manual for the not-self. It's not a manual for an awakened being. And when you've been in your experiment for long enough, however long it takes, to get that serious deconditioning going, then you can come back to some of these lines and think, I used to operate like that, and now I don't. Now that is not my knee-jerk. That is not my sort of reflex to go to that place. So it's not that it's good or bad, we see it as the detriment, because that's how Ra labeled it. And we have an association with the word detriment, but it doesn't mean that it's an inherently difficult line. It's not. Ra said that he found that most people had more trouble with their exaltations than they did with their detriments. First lines, we know, are introspective. They're only really involved in their own personal destiny. Most people who have the 7 line 1 are trying to figure out what authority is. They're not transpersonal. They're not ready to externalize authority as influence. And you'll not find many 7-1s who take on that role of being an authoritarian, because, as we know, it meets a great deal of resistance. And if you have a role in the 7th gate, that role can only be lived out according to your design, according to your definition, your type, your authority. So to play out the authoritarian, it has to be in relationship to your own nature. But genetically, once the first line meets the other, which it will not be prepared for, it expresses as the foundation of this hexagram. And it must be the authoritarian, even if it's weak, because then if the foundation is weak, everything crumbles, but that is how it's designed to be if you're operating correctly. But this is why we often find that first lines can be overly tough or overly strict, overly authoritarian, because deep inside of them, they are afraid that the foundation may just fall apart. There was an American president called Harry S. Truman, and he apparently has a sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." Somebody always has to be at the end of the line somewhere. That is the way that it works. You have probably, maybe, come across an element in human design that is called the incarnation cross. Certainly, if you've had a reading or you've looked at your chart, then you will have seen the words, even if you haven't dived into that rabbit hole yet. The very first cross structure, or the very first profile structure, really, that we come across is the 1-3. And it's called a right angle, the 1-3. But it's more to do with the profile than the incarnation cross, really, I suppose. Sorry, distracted. So the very first one is the 1-3. And that tells you that, like the first line in a hexagram, the first profile, this 1-3, it establishes the basis for all profiles. You know, it establishes the basis of what we call incarnation, really, or our evolutionary consciousness program. With a 1-3 profile, the personality is a 1. It's an authoritarian. Underneath is the 3. The unconscious is just waiting for that moment that the foundation is not secured by the personality and it's ready to break the bond, to look for something else, to try it again in another way. If you're a 1-3 profile, does this resonate with you? Be interesting to know. I'm a 2-4. This doesn't resonate to me because it's not my way. Built into the nature of humanity is the fact that no foundation, no first line is guaranteed to be eternal. You know, that they can all be subject to mutation. So first lines can actually be very forceful in the way in which they present their depths, because they want to make sure that their foundation is solid. And yet always in the back of their mind is that thought that, oh, that it could collapse. And remember that this is logical circuitry. So this is something that it should have been, in an ideal world, with the logic, it should have been tested and tested and tested before it is even brought out. So a first line in logical circuitry is going to be really deep in to checking out whether this is valid, whether this is something that is going to benefit the collective as we go into the future. So a lot of study would have gone into this before this authoritarian actually comes out and does anything with its iron fist or its gentle nature. This is a roll gate, remember, so every time you look at a first line, you can think about this line of the authoritarian. You look wherever you've got it in your chart. You know, you can relate this first line to any other hexagram. This is the magic of structure, and it's the magic of genetic continuity, because you're really immediate way to look into a chart and start to get a feel for the flavor of that chart. Really a fascinating way to start bringing all of that in. So all first lines are in some ways doing the same job. You know, all of their keynotes are in some ways interchangeable, as long as you remember that there will always be a sort of a specific focus coming through from the nature of whichever hexagram it is that you're looking at. But the authoritarian, wherever it's found, it needs to establish a foundation. And once it encounters the other, it will do this regardless of whether we're looking at a 61-1 or a 55-1 or a 32-1. It doesn't make any difference. That all of them will have that element of the authoritarian running through them. So first line is a basis and a foundation for all leadership. The foundation of leadership is obvious, really. It's authoritarian. It gives us something solid to recognize. No matter how much we would like to see the equality in all things, it doesn't exist. And what we have is a vast, glorious differentiation, a massive diversity, which creates an inherent hierarchy. It also creates a massive gene pool from which mutation can arise. So the authoritarian, the iron hand, both enlightened and despotic. In other words, authority will either be positive or negative because that depends on other factors. This is the lifetime learning, not one thing or the other. Sometimes it can be both at the same time. The grounding to gate 7 is gate 13. And in the first line, it is called empathy. So this is our earth gate for the next six days, pretty much 6 days. Next 6 lines anyway. It's the earth gate, it's another Sphinx gate, it's another G center gate. Empathy. So this is the ability to relate and commune with everybody with equanimity. So perhaps the authoritarian doesn't really care about this, but it could also come in handy to have this, ability to relate with the masses with some equanimity, with some empathy. It might make your authoritarian medicine a little easier to swallow. Not that you really care about that. An empathic authoritarian. I wonder. The moon. The moon is still in the Ajna gate 4. There for a little while longer, moves into the abstract sacral gate 29 at 11:26. This is the abysmal, the gate of perseverance, the gate of saying yes. Saying yes to something is going to start a new cycle. And starting a new cycle and getting into it, doing it correctly, cycles have to begin, middle, and end. So it requires commitment and it requires perseverance. It requires strategy and authority, of course. This circuit is all about experiences, not meeting expectations and not having preconceptions. It's all about the experience. And it leads into gate 59 at 22:31. This is called dispersion. It's the gate of sexuality. This is a tribal gate, sacral gate again. And now it gets to the point where you've said yes to something and you have now the ability to break down barriers to achieve union. This is a gate of fertility. Or not. Oh, definitely the or not here. It can be naturally intimate. It's able to break through auric barriers as it looks for union. So strategy and authority, you can imagine, are really essential in order to enter into any relationship correctly, especially these intimate relationships. You need to avoid wasting your energy on things that are superficial or dissatisfying. And of course, just because you can break down barriers, it doesn't mean that you should break down barriers. There always needs to be that awareness of strategy and authority when you've got these gates who've got such potential power within them. And the final moon gate we have is the tribal ego gate 40. And this is almost into tomorrow's transit report tomorrow because it's at 9:40 tomorrow morning we transit into gate 40. This is the gate of deliverance, the gate of aloneness, a love of work combined with the willpower to really exert oneself, naturally taking on the role of provider within a tribe or a community structure. And this gate really can push through. You have the power of that ego behind it. It will work and work. And in return, it needs to have its work appreciated. It needs to have its ego massaged a little bit, or massaged a little bit. Yeah. I get to this point and it's kind of like my words start getting mangled. You appreciate its work. And in that sense, you then start having this balance of energy. The work is appreciated so it can continue working. It will work hard for you, this gate 40. And in return, you are loyal and appreciative. And that's the bargain that comes with the 37 and 40, or just the 40 in this case. But the channel of community is all about those bargains that get built up. I'll do this for you, you do that for me. And we're all happy, apparently. It's nice, isn't it? If only life was that simple. Thank you very much for joining me today for our Newgate 7 and the first line. I will be back tomorrow, of course, with the second line. And until that point, go gently.